Thunder on the Right, Chapter 1, The New Right Network, opening with a quote from Paul Weyrich from the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress.
Organization is our bag. We preach and teach nothing but organization.
America is lurching to the right. Alarmed by the buildup of Soviet military strength, some fear for the nation's future. Many Americans are fearful of crime. They are distressed by rising taxes and double-digit inflation. Still, others worry that their schools will be destroyed by busing. The list of code words that refer to the object of their fears seems endless. Forced busing, abortion, gun control, permissiveness, gay rights, women's lib, the surrender of the Panama Canal, reverse discrimination, and on and on. Many Americans, especially lower middle-class Americans of the Midwest, South, and West, are convinced that existing leaders have failed to confront these issues. As the allegiance of Americans to the two major political parties continues to decline, they turn for the redress of grievances to new structures of political power and new leaders. Rising to address and exploit these anxieties is a new set of self-appointed leaders, men and women of the new right. One Republican political professional estimated in 1977 that the new right now constitutes the
fourth most powerful political force in America,
behind the two major parties and organized labor. These leaders and the organizations they represent seek radical social and political change, and, unlike previous radicals of the right, they have built a political and organizational network through which to further those aims. Until the 1960s, there had been almost no relevant right-wing organization in America. Rightists could be found in non-ideological groups, such as the Republican Party or the National Association of Manufacturers, but there were no ideologically conservative groups as such, with the exception of the Americans for Constitutional Action, a Capitol Hill-based organization that issued ratings of senators and congressmen and
stood against collective morality and a socialized economy through centralization of power.
In the 1950s and 60s, the John Birch Society and other far-out groups emerged, but John P. Roach, dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and one-time professor of Americans for Democratic Action, urged in the new leader that the
menace from the right
was,
in effective political terms, a mythical bogey, a vapor of the perfivid liberal imagination,
with no home in American politics, no institutional base, no party, no real understanding or serious interest in the political process beyond the level of theater. In any list of realistic fears, Roach sardonically said, fear of the radical right would rank 23rd
between the fear of being eaten by piranhas and the fear of college presidents.
Richard J. Whalen, an aide to President Richard Nixon, made much the same point in his book Taking Sides from 1974.
It might almost be said that conservatism gained ground in the 50s and early 60s in spite of efforts to organize. The movement of organized conservative groups was long on self-appointed leaders who were egotists, dogmatists, hucksters, and eccentrics, all engaged in a childish sandbox politics and being very noisy about it. Often referred to by liberals as the radical right, such organizations were more accurately described as the irrelevant right.
By the 1970s, the right had been transformed into an institutionalized, disciplined, well-organized, and well-financed movement of loosely knit affiliates, collecting millions of dollars in small contributions from blue-collar workers and housewives. The new right feeds on discontent, anger, insecurity, and resentment, and flourishes on backlash politics. Through its interlocking network, it seeks to veto whatever it perceives to threaten its way of life: busing, women's liberation, gay rights, pornography, loss of the Panama Canal, and promotes a beefed-up defense budget, lower taxes, and reduced federal regulation of small businesses. Moreover, the new right exploits social protest and encourages class hostility by trying to fuel the hostilities of lower middle-class Americans against those above and below them on the economic ladder. Wholly bipartisan, although predominantly Republican, the New Right Network supports whoever shares its desire for radical political change and its resentments of the status quo. As such, the New Right is anything but conservative. The New Right affiliates include large multi-purpose umbrella groups like the American Conservative Union and the Conservative Caucus organizations like Young Americans for Freedom, designed to train young leaders, educational think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, periodicals and publishing houses like Conservative Digest and Green Hill Publications, tax-exempt legal foundations, and public interest law firms like the Washington Legal Foundation, congressional lobbies like Christian Voice, research arms like the National Conservative Research and Education Foundation, groups to provide research for right-wing state legislators like the American Legal Exchange Council, or ALEC, and, on the fringes, a vast array of single-interest groups, ad hoc or long-run, that work on an informal basis with the more established political bodies. The New Right also includes numerous political action committees, or PACs, dedicated to financing the political campaigns of like-minded candidates and wrecking those of moderates or liberals. Direct mail solicitation of small sums is at the core of the New Right's organizational sophistication, and the leaders of the New Right have mastered the art by taking their message directly to the living rooms of their constituents via their mailboxes. Through the accumulation of lists of supporters, they have built a national following to which they can appeal for money, to bankroll their organizations, and which they can mobilize for political action. Although it would be a mistake to assume that this New Right is a monolithic conspiratorial network with a single purpose, it is no more monolithic and single-purposed nor conspiratorial, I suspect, than the liberal community. The new right-wingers do not work at cross-purposes. They have been, to a considerable extent, effective in linking into a national network of many of the local groups organized from time to time in response to specific concerns. Their leaders are fundraiser Richard A. Viguerie, Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, Howard Phillips of the Conservative Caucus, John T. Dolan of the National Conservative Political Action Committee, Reed Larson of the National Right to Work Committee, journalists Patrick J. Buchanan and William Rusher, single-issue activists such as Phyllis Schlafly of Stop ERA, and representatives of fundamentalist evangelists such as the Reverend Jerry Falwell. They meet regularly with right-wing congressmen and senators to plot strategy and establish goals for their movement. Often at these meetings, leadership of local controversies involving textbook selection or gay rights or abortion will participate. The New Right calls itself the New Right, a designation chosen by close associates of Richard A. Viguerie to distinguish its leadership from what they believe to be the slightly effete conservative leadership of the East Coast. For example, William F. Buckley Jr. and his National Review. The New Right and the more traditional conservatives are engaged in a struggle for the soul of their shared constituency, and the New Right has won the first skirmishes. Its emergence has dismayed many conservatives who fear that a reactionary New Right, willing to work with groups like the John Birch Society, will lead American conservatism back into what Richard J. Wallen has called the sandbox. They regard the New Right as anti-intellectual, insensitive to questions of civil liberties, hostile to reforms, more concerned with using political processes for social protest than with improving the quality of life in America by informed public policy and ameliorative social programs. Because they believe New Right dominance could mean the end of a responsible conservatism in America, the conservatives have viewed with encouragement and optimism the rise of the neoconservative, intellectual movement of ex-liberal scholars like Irving Kristol in New York and others in the Eastern universities. The New Right itself is deeply suspicious of any Eastern elitists and sees little ground for cooperation. The last outpost of the old right, the most active and responsible of the right-of-center umbrella groups, an organization that has courted neoconservatives like Kristol and yet worked with New Right activists like Phyllis Schlafly, is the American Conservative Union, founded in 1964 specifically to institutionalize the Draft Goldwater movement. now equipped with satellite research groups and fundraising apparatus. It was originally the brainchild of such stalwart traditional conservatives as William F. Buckley Jr., James J. Kilpatrick, and M. Stanton Evans, whose influence in the organization has declined as that of the New Right with its neo-populist tinge has grown. Though the American Conservative Union functions as an adjunct of the New Right groups, there remains within it a substantial number of conservatives who try to maintain it, along with the National Review, as an outpost of traditional conservatism. The American Conservative Union claims 300,000 members. With a growing budget, the American Conservative Union spearheaded the anti-Panama Canal treaties effort in 1977 and 78. In its first year of lobbying, the Union spent more than $1.4 million purchasing anti-ratification commercials on several hundred radio and television stations across the country, publishing ads in major newspapers, and mailing more than 2.4 million letters to mobilize sentiment against what they called the surrender of American property. Ronald Reagan's campaign for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976 and the public outcry against the Panama Canal treaties proved a boon to the group. In 1978, it increased its fundraising revenues by 33% over those of the previous year, boosting income from contributions to $3.1 million. It stepped up its state activities, adding affiliates, 42 in mid-1979, in Nebraska, Tennessee, Oregon, and Alabama. Smaller local affiliates were organized in Florida, Texas, New Jersey, Missouri, Georgia, and North and South Carolina, with the aid of 2 full-time field representatives. The organization is most effective on Capitol Hill. Alone among right-wing groups, it has learned the advantages of coalition on selected issues with liberal organizations, a tactic that might have been viewed as tantamount to treason by new rightists. It was the founder of the Coalition Ad Hoc Committee for Airline Regulatory Reform, collaborating with Ralph Nader's Congress Watch and Americans for Democratic Action. In 1977, the committee lobbied successfully for passage of the Airline Regulatory Reform Act. The organization favors free market economics and strong national defense. It sponsors frequent educational seminars and a research arm, the Education Research Institute, which sponsors, in turn, the National Journalism Center, under the direction of former American Conservative Union Chairman M. Stanton Evans. This last Capitol Hill-based operation trains young right-of-center writers in the hope of placing them in professional positions as news reporters. The American Conservative Union is itself a training ground for future political leaders. It took pride in the victory of Jeffrey Bell, once political director of the American Conservative Union, over liberal Republican Senator Clifford Case in the 1977 New Jersey Republican primary. With genuine conservatives like Human Events editor Thomas Winter on its board, the American Conservative Union has remained more responsible and moderate than most new right groups, despite its obsession with symbolic issues like the Panama Canal treaties, on which it takes predictably rigid positions. It was, however, diverted from serious matters of public policy in 77 and 78, when, during Illinois Congressman Philip Crane's tenure as chairman, Crane's supporters attempted to transform the organization into a vehicle for his bid for the GOP presidential nomination. Crane's ambitions became too much even for some of his early supporters on the group's governing board. He was replaced as chairman by Maryland Republican Congressman Robert E. Bauman.
With Crane in charge, the whole ACU operation remained predictably obsessed with drum beating and not the least interested in having a genuine impact on American government and policy.
According to one longtime ACU board member,
we had a genuine opportunity back then to get the ACU out of the silly anti-New Deal politics that possess these unreconstructed McKinleyites like Phil Crane, but the McKinleyites maintained control, and this tendency toward what I call social protest prevails even today in the organization, and, as you'd expect, followed Crane into his quixotic bid for the GOP nomination.
From conservative to new right, The replacement of Philip Crane as chairman of the American Conservative Union was a reflection of an attempt by traditional conservatives within the Washington, D.C. area to minimize the influence of new right leaders like Colorado brewer Joseph Coors, his Washington political operative Paul Weyrich, and fundraiser Richard A. Viguerie, all of whom were too close to Crane for comfort. The traditional conservatives are convinced that the Viguerie-Coors-Weyrich faction intends to dominate the American Conservative Union. Viguerie, for example, repeatedly tried to buy Human Events, the well-established weekly with which the Conservative Union is closely associated. When rebuffed, he founded his own magazine, Conservative Digest, in 1975. The attempt by new right leaders to control the organization can be traced to Coors' decision in 1971 to bankroll right-wing organizations. That year he sent Jack Wilson, a professional aide, to Washington to look for promising organizations for Coors to support. Coors met Weyrich, then press secretary to former Colorado Senator Gordon Allott, and came to rely for advice on the former broadcast journalist. During the next 2 years, Coors contributed about $200,000 to the Analysis Research Corporation, which had been established to conduct research for conservatives in Congress. Internal feuding reduced the effectiveness of the group, and Coors then invested in another research group, the Robert M. Schuchman Foundation, a tax-exempt center for public interest law in Washington, named for a youthful conservative activist who died at the age of 27. Coors began to pump money into this group, much to the discomfort of a number of conservatives on the Schuchman Foundation board, who feared that the brewers' influence was altering the charitable organization's activities and placing too much emphasis on political projects. As one observer told me,
what Weyrich and Coors really wanted was a vehicle for their activities, which included a certain degree of lobbying and political action. It was less expensive, of course, if they could conduct this business under the tax exemption that the Foundation enjoyed, but this could risk revocation of that exemption, or worse.
This issue came to a head in January 1974 at a Schuchman Foundation board meeting in Washington. Members of the board concerned about legal ramifications, a group that included Human Events editor Thomas Winter and Washington attorneys Daniel Joy and Douglas Caddy, demanded answers of Coors. As one participant said at the meeting,
"We could all be subject to a degree of personal liability for some of the things that are being done in the name of this organization, and we want it out in the open now. We want no part of it."
Shortly thereafter, Coors withdrew his financial support and the Schuchman Foundation became inactive. In its place, Coors and Weyrich formed the Heritage Foundation, incorporated in the District of Columbia in 1973. Although Paul Weyrich, who described himself to me as
a political mechanic,
lacking a college education, was its first president, the Heritage Foundation surprised many observers by becoming a rather respectable research institution. It issued many solid studies and analyses to the press and to House and Senate officers. It was once under the direction of Edwin J. Fulner, Republican Study Committee Chief. It publishes the highly regarded Policy Review, a quarterly featuring articles by Dr. Walter Williams, a black economist from Temple University, psychiatrist and author Ernest Vandenhag, and defense analyst Eugene V. Rothstow. It has been praised as a
worthy addition to the world of political commentary
by neoconservative Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York. But it is unusual for a research institution to have a staff ideology, as the Heritage Foundation has. Its studies invariably confirm the notions to which its conservative colleagues and trustees, who include Coors, Wilson, former Reagan aide Frank Walton, and California industrialist J. Robert Fluor, are already committed. The founder's real interest, in the author's view based on the observation of a year or more, appears to be less with balanced public policy research and more with the provision of support for new right opinions. There is a footnote here which says the following. In 1979, I asked the director of another and much smaller educational institute linked to a large conservative organization if his group ever commissioned a study, the results of which did not uphold the preconceived right-wing position. He said yes. A study of gun control legislation failed to support the conservative position. I asked if the study was published. No, he replied. We axed it. The power struggle within the Schuchman Foundation was not unlike that within another right-of-center organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, a fledgling alliance of state legislatures put together by Juanita Barnett, an Illinois Republican activist who was its first executive director. ALEC, as the group is called, was also the target of a takeover by a Weyrich-led group that came in with outside funding which they used to seize control of the organization. As Barnett has recalled, she was approached in 1974 by Illinois State Representative Donald Toden, who asked her to help organize the group, which would function as a clearinghouse of legislative research for state legislators. When Mrs. Barnett began to solicit funds, a representative of the Heritage Foundation independently contacted Richard Larry, an employee of the Sarah Scafee Family Charitable Trusts, an arm of the Mellon Fortune of Pennsylvania, which routinely funds conservative causes. Obtaining the needed funds from the Scafee Foundation, the new group dismissed Mrs. Barnett from her position. She subsequently sued the organization, which settled out of court, and moved it to Washington, D.C. from Chicago, and added to its board Weyrich, Frank Walton of the Heritage Foundation, and Edwin Fulner. Mrs. Barnett asked Weyrich
why Scafee wanted to invest $80,000 in ALEC, and he told me, Juanita, ALEC is the only state legislative organization in the country of our persuasion which has a 501c3, the IRS designation indicating a tax-exempt status. If they took ALEC to Washington and did a good job, they, Walton, Fulner, Weyrich, could go back to SKAIF, and get SKAIF to set up a political action committee to finance the state legislative campaign races. He assured me that he was not trying to buy the state legislators, but the possibility of some campaign funding for them was there.
Another member of the organization's board also expressed concern that the Scafee Foundation might seek to control the organization. He telephoned the spokesman who told him that the organization he represented
operates on the golden rule. Whoever has the gold rules.
Sure enough, gold did rule. The Weyrich Foundation prevailed, and the organization, funded by the Scafee Foundation, moved to Washington, where it became an adjunct of the growing New Right Network.
They really wanted to get rid of me because I knew what they were trying to do with the organization, and they knew I would have no part in it,
Barnett told me. She concluded from examining records of telephone calls and methods of payment within the organization that they wanted to use the tax exemption status as a shelter under which to conduct political activity.
They were trying when they fired me to turn the organization into an arm of the Reagan campaign by funneling tax-deductible contributions through ALEC to be used to finance pro-Reagan activities.
From July 1974 through January 1976, the American Legislative Exchange Council operated from Totten's office, and according to Barnett, it paid no rent.
On more than one occasion, I was reimbursed for activities that were being performed for ALEC, and not for official state business.
Vouchers I have seen, with which Totten arranged for her payment, list Barnett as a legislative aide, when, in fact, according to her, she was employed solely by ALEC.
I made a number of calls, long-distance calls, at the expense of the state representative's office, because I was instructed to use the state rep's line for the ALEC calls.
In a September 1978 meeting, the American Legislative Exchange Council's Washington headquarters urged its Pennsylvania office to reject the District of Columbia Voting Rights Amendment, then under consideration by the Pennsylvania legislature. Included in the mailing were a Heritage Foundation study, a press release from Senator Richard Schweiker, a clipping of an article by Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, and editorials from various newspapers, all unanimously adopted by ALEC board members urging
the legislatures of the 50 states to reject the proposed constitutional amendment granting congressional and senatorial representation to the District of Columbia.
Several years earlier, in 1975, a letter from ALEC's attorney at the time, Michael M. Ushijima, to the Internal Revenue Service, had described the functions of ALEC as follows.
The organization would make no attempt whatsoever to oppose or support pending legislation other than providing research material to member legislators as regards to model legislation. The organization would take no steps nor devote any funds or personnel to the support or opposition of pending legislation or the support, opposition, or introduction of any model legislation provided to any member.
Campaign treasuries. Among the immediate consequences of this internecine power struggle on the right was the creation of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, formed by Wyrick and Coors in 1974. Before the committee was formed, Wyrick had urged the brewer to contribute to the Conservative Victory Fund of the American Conservative Union. He told Coors, however, that he believed the organization was not as effective as it should be because it employed no field representatives. At Wyrick's suggestion, Coors began to contribute to the new Political Action Committee, which Wyrick then headed. He had left the Heritage Foundation to become more actively involved in political campaigns. With Figuri as fundraiser,
CSFC raised twice as much money as the Conservative Victory Fund did at the same period of time,
Wyrick told the Washington Post. Coors also contributed money of some of his employees.
How did Coors raise the money?
The Post asked.
He just goes around the office and collects it, Wyrick answered.
Now housed in a renovated garage behind the Library of Congress in Washington, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress is one of the best financed of the New Right's political action committees, which are federally sanctioned campaign finance organizations. In large part, it can be credited with the election of New Right Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah in 1977. It does not, however, contribute to the campaigns of incumbents. As Wyrick told the Conservative Digest,
if a conservative congressman cannot turn the $1 million worth of prerogatives he receives every 2 years to his political advantage, the way incumbent liberals do, then there is nothing CSFC can do to help him.
Such hard-headed politics, as well as skillful placement of well-trained field representatives, accounts for the group's success, which even Human Events, the weekly most closely associated with the competitive Conservative Victory Fund, noted.
The Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress deserves credit for establishing outstanding precinct organizations in numerous campaigns.
The New Right group's ideology is suggested by its analysis of the 1977 House of Representatives, which identified 32% of all congressmen as radicals, with those considered very liberal coming in second. A similar pattern held in the Senate, whose radicals included liberals Edmund Muskie of Maine, Jacob Javits of New York, and Clifford Case of New Jersey, neoconservative Moynihan of New York, centrist Henry Jackson of Washington, moderate William Proxmire of Wisconsin, and even West Virginia's Robert C. Byrd, a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, were labeled very liberal. Another major New Right political arm is the National Conservative Political Action Committee, which raised more money than any other conservative group in 1976, a sum in excess of $3 million. Its modern offices in Rosslyn, Virginia, house 4 full-time employees and as many as 40 part-time workers, led by Executive Director John T. Dolan, who came up through the ranks of the Young Republicans. Most responsible for its creation, however, was Charles Black, formerly an aide to the right-wing North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms and, in 1979, employed by the Reagan campaign. In 77 and 78, Black served as political director of the Republican National Committee. The National Conservative Political Action Committee, also known as NCPAC, relies heavily on in-kind contributions to the candidates it supports.
What is the Nick Pack secret?
Asked a fundraising letter by Helms on March 11th, 1977.
They provide campaign experts, in-press relations, voter surveys, TV advertising, campaign management, and more, instead of merely dumping cash into a campaign and hoping for the best. One of the reasons for the solid success record of Nick Pack is their insistence on providing more than just financial assistance in a campaign.
The letter by Helms continued.
Nick Pack prefers to give technical political assistance to a campaign, thereby ensuring that campaigns are run on a sound basis.
Helms praised its
cadre of top professional consultants.
Human Events credited the 1978 election of Republican Senator Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire to last-minute efforts by the organization. Nick Pack is committed to supporting Democrats as well as Republicans, and about 10% of the candidates who received contributions in 1978 were Democrats. When I asked how Nick Pack plans to find Democrats conservative enough to support in future races, Dolan himself, a Republican, told me,
"We're going to have to recruit them."
The only partisan political action committee of the right dead set against backing Democrats is Citizens for the Republic, formed with the money left over from the 1976 Reagan campaign. It began with nearly $1 million, a list of 183,000 contributors to the Reagan effort, and Reagan's exceedingly marketable name. In the fall of '78, according to a Citizens for the Republic fundraising letter, the NBC Nightly News described it as
the most advanced presidential campaign ever. This is far before an election.
Prompting the letter to explain,
the fact is, CFTR is in no way a Reagan campaign organization. Under federal law, it cannot be. But there is no question that it has quickly become the most effective, multi-candidate political action committee in our nation.
True or not, there can be little question that it greatly enhanced the Californians' chances to become the GOP standard-bearer in 1980. According to the Washington Post, it footed the bills when Reagan toured the country week after week in '78 to promote the candidacies of Republican hopefuls, taping as many as 54 radio endorsements and 12 television spots in 1 week. The committee also spent thousands of dollars in '78 to promote other GOP candidates. It sponsored seminars, placed campaign workers in a number of GOP campaigns, and published a twice-monthly newsletter which claims it
prints the news one seldom finds, but should, in the mass media.
In addition to the major political action committees of the New Right, dozens more, much smaller but well-financed, are concentrating their efforts in regional campaigns. An example is the Western Intermountain Network Political Action Committee, see Chapter 2. WinPAC, as it's called, contributes money to right-wing office seekers in Montana and other mountain states. The Cadets. Young Americans for Freedom, an organization of aggressive young patriots, is the most active and well-organized of right-wing youth corps, and quite possibly the best financed. Although its heyday was in the wild '60s. Despite its conservative heritage, it was founded in 1960 by William F. Buckley, after all. It has become increasingly influenced by new rightist attitudes, a natural development, perhaps, since other early leaders included Howard Phillips and Richard A. Viguieri. The organization was intended to be an institutionalized protest by junior GOPers, convinced that Richard Nixon had sold out to the hated Rockefeller in 1960 at the Republican National Convention. In the early days, it was a New York City-based organization operating out of conservative fundraiser Martin Liebman's Madison Avenue offices. But since that time, it has expanded its scope to include active chapters in the South and West. Its salad days may be long past. In recent years, it has been characterized by what otherwise sympathetic writer Richard J. Whalen has called cannibalistic attitudes, which have resulted in unseemly brawling among its leaders. YAF leaders pass lengthy resolutions at their conventions, but avoid specific controversies as, for example, a position for or against the decriminalization of marijuana, a subject on which their opinions might carry some genuine weight. Instead, the organization concerns itself with matters of global import, a questionable preoccupation, as suggested by the following exchange on William F. Buckley's Firing Line television program between liberal commentator Jeff Greenfield and a number of YAF spokesmen on the occasion of the group's 1977 convention. Greenfield.
Do you all agree with the proposition that the war in Vietnam was a case of an American commitment that should have been kept and was not, that is, that the war was essentially a worthy cause?
Frank Donatelli, the outgoing YAF executive director.
With some modifications.
Greenfield.
Okay, sir. How many of you enlisted in the armed forces of the United States?
None had. John Buckley, YAF's newly elected national chairman.
A strong commitment to the war wouldn't necessarily require that we individually go out and wage the war physically if you're trying to allude to the extent to which we were willing to back up by our own sacrifices our commitment to that event. I think that among ourselves and among the rest of the leadership of those folks on the college campus who favor the U.S. position in the war certainly revealed the extent of that sacrifice in terms of grades and in terms of being active in the battle on campuses.
Greenfield.
No, I'm sorry, John. I don't think getting a C+ instead of an A is equivalent to slogging through the mud in Vietnam.
Later, Greenfield asked,
Is there anything in the YAF program that an outsider might be surprised at? To ask the question less charitably, is there anything about any YAF positions one would not be able to call knee-jerk, conservative, or utterly predictable?
Donatelli.
Well, I would say that there are a large number, the voluntary military, which we once again have reaffirmed our support for.
Greenfield. Excuse me.
But I was specifically going to exempt that on grounds of self-interest.
Laughter. Donatelli.
The question you asked me was, is there anything unpredictable?
Greenfield.
Yes, I think it's utterly predictable.
On the marijuana question, Greenfield suggested that he found it odd that a conservative
would want to place in the hands of a state prosecutor, a government official, if you want to load it, the power to send somebody to jail for smoking a marijuana cigarette.
Robert Heckman.
But that was not our position we took at this convention. We did not take a position on the decriminalization of marijuana.
Donatelli.
We felt that, with the very large division in our ranks as to the merits of the question, that this was something that we should not compel YAF as an organization to take a position on.
William F. Buckley, Jr.
Very libertarian.
Greenfield.
It's like anarchists not meeting because they cannot agree on a time.
For a young person's organization, YAF seems complacent, perhaps for the very good reason that it has almost ceased to be a young person's organization. With less and less contact with college campuses, it operates out of a wooded estate in the rolling hills of Northern Virginia and not, as one might assume, from a rented room with a battered mimeograph machine in some run-down Capitol Hill townhouse or Cambridge apartment. Before purchasing the land in Virginia, Young Americans for Freedom maintained offices in an elegant apartment building near Washington, D.C.'s Embassy Row. For its conventions, it selects costly and lavish hotels. Its membership seems to be getting older, and its rolls smaller. Although it claims to have 55,000 members, a 7th of February 79 mailing from the office of its Director of State and Chapter Services to members of its National Board reported membership at 6,582, up 3% since the 1st of November 78. Only 3 of the California chapters, to take one state as typical of all, are located on college campuses. None in the high schools, and 16 in communities. When this writer was employed by YAF in 76 as editor of its monthly magazine, New Guard, one member of the governing board had teenage children, and those members who were under 30 were, for the most part, professionals in the process of building comfortable careers as attorneys or professional political operatives, their days as campus counter-revolutionaries long past. YAF has demonstrated decreasing interest in educational programs, with most of its activity in the late 70s being devoted to advancing the political careers of its tight clique of leaders. All of this has prompted Liebman to suggest to me that the organization, which he calls
boring and bureaucratized,
ought to close its doors, Its national conventions are so tightly controlled that not once in the past 16 years has a candidate not endorsed by the national office been elected. The 76 Reagan campaign looked like old home week to the Yaffers. A number of Reagan's closest aides, including Charles Black, Lauren Smith, David Keene, and fundraiser Bruce Aberle, are Yaff alumni, as is Maryland Congressman Robert Bauman, who was elected chairman of the American Conservative Union in 1979. Another alumnus is Tom Charles Houston, who left politics to practice law in Indianapolis in the mid-70s, and is the author of the infamous plan to create an extra-legal secret police independent of the FBI, intended to operate at the sole discretion of the president.
Use of this technique is clearly illegal, wrote Houston.
Then a White House secretary expert in a memo urging President Nixon to authorize the plan. Nixon signed it on the 23rd of July, 1970. Houston was executive director of Young Americans for Freedom in 1965 and 66. As the organization's 1979 convention at Washington, D.C.'s Shoreham Americana, a mock presidential election was held, with the Wisconsin chairman reporting 6 votes for former Senator Joseph McCarthy.
A man who truly believes it's better to be dead than red.
Despite the tough talk suggested by the fight song,
back to back, belly to belly, burn their bodies with napalm jelly. Back to back, belly to belly, it's a Hanoi jamboree. Joanne Bez was singing a song, favorin' the Viet Cong. Put the goo in every left-winger. Joanne Bez was a real torch singer.
YAF members tend to be docile and obedient, not much given to carrying out threats. As conservative writer Noel Parmentel Jr. has written in Esquire,
while enthusiastic even unto ecstasy, the Young Americans for Freedom are hopelessly schizoid as a disciplined political group. On the one hand, they display orthodox Führerprinzip, fawning upon the new right's big guns to the point of bystander discomfort. But this embarrassing servility toward their betters is more than counterbalanced by their stilettos out intramural policy. While patriotism appeals to these boys, the rest of us will have to manage to keep it a republic without much assistance from YAF. They drink beer but are poor, putsch material. Mainly, the YAFs couldn't punch their way through a soaking wet copy of Human Events.
Increasing in stature as a right-wing organization is the Young Republican National Federation, which, with the teenage Republicans and the college Republicans, represents the official youth arm of the GOP. The Young Republicans have been controlled by party right-wingers since 1955. In 1977, the organization elected, as its national chairman, Roger J. Stone, a former Reagan campaign worker who served as treasurer of the National Conservative Political Action Committee. The right-wingers first took control during the Eisenhower years, when William Rusher, now National Review publisher and GOP strategist F. Clifton White, arranged the election of John Ashbrook, now a conservative Ohio congressman, to the Young Republicans' top spot. The coalition that backed Ashbrook, Rusher wrote, was
more or less, frankly, an anti-Rockefeller, anti-Eastern, and anti-liberal alliance. Despite its junior status,
columnist M. Stanton Evans has written,
the YRNF has been an accurate indicator of the past trends in general, presaging trends that have later taken hold in the senior GOP. In 1963, for instance, the YR convention in San Francisco saw the first organized victory for forces aligned with Senator Barry Goldwater. In that contest, Goldwater backed Donald E. Butts Lukens, and later an Ohio congressman, was elected chairman over a candidate with formal conservative credentials, then as now required in YR politics. But who had the backing of the Rockefeller wing? Lukens's win foreshadowed the rising Goldwater strength inside the party.
The 1977 Young Republicans election was explicitly revealing. Contending for the chairmanship were Richard Evans, a right-winger from Louisville, Kentucky, and Roger Stone, the former NICPAC treasurer from Alexandria, Virginia. Stone, with endorsements from Senators Jake Garn of Utah and Paul Lexalt of Nevada, put together a well-organized campaign that had support from Reagan aides Black, Keene, and John Sears, the GOP national campaign manager. Disinterested observers were stunned to learn of Stone's past activities from Walter Cronkite on his CBS Evening News on the evening of Stone's election. According to the Senate Watergate report, Stone, while employed as a quote-unquote scheduler in the office of Herbert L. Bart Porter at the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, had been deeply involved in the Nixon Committee's Dirty Tricks campaign. He used an alias, Jason Rayner, to recruit a young agent to infiltrate several 72 Democratic election campaigns. The agent, Michael McMinoway of Louisville, was not told for whom he was working, but he reported back to Stone, and the information was relayed in turn to Porter, then eventually to H.R. Haldeman in the White House and to John Mitchell at CREEP. When White House aide Charles Colson suggested to colleagues that someone be sent to New Hampshire to make a contribution to the 1972 presidential primary challenge of California Congressman Pete McCloskey,
on behalf of some radical group,
as the Senate Watergate report put it, Stone received the assignment. Instructed by Porter to give $135 in cash to the McCloskey effort there in the name of the Gay Liberation Front, he persuaded Porter that he should give the cash contribution instead in the name of the Young Socialist Alliance. Stone and Porter then drafted an anonymous letter to William Loeb's Manchester Union leader, enclosing a photocopy of the receipt Stone had received from the McCloskey campaign worker. Loeb, assuming its authenticity, printed the letter along with a front-page editorial critical of McCloskey. A number of young Republicans were distressed by these shenanigans, anxious to cleanse themselves of the taint of the Nixon scandal. The Stone supporters, with the help of their Washington connections, successfully portrayed the young Republicans' campaign as an ideological battle, painting Evans, a Reagan delegate to the 76 Republican Presidential Convention in Kansas City, as captive of the Rockefeller liberals. Confronted by such a technically skillful campaign, Evans was badly beaten at the polls. Once again, the candidate of the conservative movement, as apologists for Stone's Watergate past called him, maintained control of the young Republicans. Stone promptly put into practice an intensive direct mail fundraising program. Revenues increased from about $34,000 for the 2-year period ending in 1975 to $491,000 from 1977 to the fall of 78. The organization became active on other fronts as well, putting heavy emphasis on the training of young political leaders. As a consequence, the 79 Young Republican Leadership Conference was dominated by the New Right. The convention presented an Americanism Award to former Nixon aide Pat Buchanan, who once advocated, according to the Senate Watergate report, that the White House secretly sponsor the candidacy for a black president in 72 to drain votes from Nixon's Democratic challenger. A third key element of the right-wing youth movement is the Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, an organization for which Viguerie raises money. It is under the direction of Morton Blackwell, for years a Viguerie employee and editor of the New Right Report. This organization, which conducts seminars to train young activists in campaign management techniques, contributes to political campaigns and places its graduates on key Senate and congressional campaign staffs. One self-described Republican progressive who has attended campaign management schools conducted by many Republican groups gives credit where it's due. The committee's seminars, he told me, are
very good. Blackwell knows his business.
The one disturbing element, he said, is that the teachers at the sessions
make it clear enough that they believe some of the dirtier aspects of campaigning are just politics, and to be encouraged on the basis that the other side does it too.
According to the Senate Watergate report, the individual responsible for recommending Agent Michael McMinoway to Roger Stone for the Nixon Committee's Dirty Tricks campaign was Morton Blackwell. Pro-business groups. Learning from the success of their liberal counterparts, the new rightists by the late 1970s had discovered the advantages of fighting on all fronts. Taking a page from Ralph Nader and the environmentalists, the new rightists formed their own public interest law firms. In the 1970s, expanding their organizational activities into the broader area of tax-exempt foundations. The most important of these is the Pacific Legal Foundation, founded in 1973 by Ronald Zumbrun, an advisor to California Governor Ronald Reagan on welfare reform. The Pacific Legal Foundation maintains a staff of more than 20 lawyers. In 1979, it operated on a budget of $2 million a year, according to its own annual report. Right-wing legal fronts, their leaders readily admit, were started to counteract the growing influence of such organizations as the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Club.
We're trying to show that there are different ideas about what is the public interest,
explained the director of the Pacific Legal Defense Foundation's Washington office in Conservative Digest. California industrialist J. Robert Fleur said,
"We felt somebody had to be there in court to give the other side. A lot of times, in the case of jobs, for instance, we felt the public interest wasn't really represented by public interest law firms."
Originally concerned with abuses of welfare programs, a matter of great concern to businessmen who display little hostility to government subsidies to business, the organization has recently moved into the larger area of governmental regulation. By 1978, the Pacific Legal Foundation had participated in 150 court cases, many involving environmental standards. The group challenged the research procedures of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and succeeded in reversing an Environmental Protection Agency decision to ban the use of pesticides in northwestern forests. The Pacific Legal Foundation, according to an article by Julian Weiss in Conservative Digest, believes
that whenever government issues a regulation or sets policies, some analysis of costs and benefits should be made. Decisions by EPA and OSHA bureaucrats have cost thousands of jobs. In each case, PLF asks the court to take into account the loss of employment, burdens of high prices passed on to consumers, or consequences of government meddling in the private sector.
Another public interest law firm, the Washington Legal Foundation, is headed by former Nixon administration lawyer Don Pompeo, who was called Ralph Nader,
the most dangerous man in America since Lee Harvey Oswald.
In 1976, Pompeo's group, more blatantly political than the Pacific Legal Foundation, sued to prevent President Carter from implementing the Panama Canal treaties until the U.S. House of Representatives also approved them. Acting with the support of 60 congressmen, it lost in the U.S. Court of Appeals. It also sued to overturn a recent ruling by the Federal Election Commission, which the Washington Legal Foundation held allowed the Democratic National Committee to use large contributions to pay off old campaign debts. Like the Pacific Legal Foundation, the group is also involved in the fight to protect business and industry from costly government regulations. And in 1977, it successfully persuaded a federal court to order a grand jury trial for a mine operator fined by the Federal Mining Enforcement and Safety Administration for violations of safety regulations. There are in all about 10 rightist legal organizations, and most side primarily with business interests in court. The Board of Trustees of the Pacific Legal Foundation chiefly composed of representatives of large corporations. A rightist consumer group that openly courts financial backing from business and industry is the Consumer Alert Council, directed by Barbara Keating, an American Conservative Union board member. Formed in 1977, Consumer Alert has worked with the Pacific Legal Foundation to redefine consumerism. According to Mrs. Keating, this will benefit both businesses and the average American. Mrs. Keating is trying, with some success, to sell the American people on the notion that governmental regulations imposed at the behest of Naderite and other groups are harmful to the consumer.
The cost of regulating businesses is always passed down to the consumer in higher prices,
she told me. The common hamburger, she tells American lawmakers in frequent legislative testimony, is now affected by 41,000 regulations, 200 legal statutes, and 111,000 precedent-setting court decisions. Consumer Alert appeals to citizens groups as well as business and industry for much of its funding, choosing to avoid massive direct mail fundraising. One rightist organization that does not like to be regarded as a front for business interests, although the courts see it as such, is the National Right to Work Committee and its legal arm, the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Founded in 1955 by then-Congressman Fred Hartley, co-sponsor of the Taft-Hartley Act, the National Right to Work Committee is led by Reed Larson, who was first involved in right-to-work disputes as state chairman of the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. His group claims 1.25 million members, and so great is the volume of mail that pours forth from its offices that it has been awarded its own zip code. To maintain this heavy direct mail fundraising operation, it spends an estimated $2 million each year on postage alone. Although Larson has insisted that his organization is interested only in the issue of compulsory unionism, it has nevertheless been involved since the mid-60s in legislative battles touching all aspects of the American trade union movement. In 76, for example, President Gerald Ford was ready to sign into law the Common Citus Picketing Bill, a measure having little bearing on right to work, until Larson's membership deluged the White House with letters. Ford vetoed the bill. In 77, the AFL-CIO put up its own Common Citus Bill, and with a sympathetic President Carter in the Oval Office, the measure was expected to move smoothly through Congress and into law. Again, Larson mobilized his troops, and the bill failed to make it even through the House of Representatives. In 78, the Carter administration produced a labor law reform package, and Larson went into action again. The Washington Post reported,
"Labor law bill starts paper blizzard."
In January and February of 78 alone, the committee mailed roughly 8 million letters and, in one day, placed full-page advertisements in 30 major newspapers from coast to coast. Committee supporters blanketed the offices of their senators with 6 million letters, cards, and telegrams urging them to reject the quote-unquote labor bosses bill. The bill was beaten. Human Events reported,
"Major credit for blocking the so-called Labor Law Reform Act should go to the National Right to Work Committee. In 6 months, the committee spent $1.5 million galvanizing oppositions to the scheme. The committee placed more than 500 newspaper ads and mailed more than 12 million letters, generating heavy mail to wavering senators."
One prominent conservative activist familiar with the committee's activities told me that it is a pro-business lobby whose ostensible purpose of fighting compulsory unionism is in fact subordinate to its larger interest in furthering right-wing political causes that go beyond the strict issue of right to work. Another activist employed by the organization expressed a great disappointment with the direction Larson has taken in recent years, calling it
"just another part of the right-wing fundraising machine."
Similar in function to the National Right to Work Committee is the Public Service Research Council, dedicated to preventing public sector unions. Although Larson has denied it, it is widely believed that this group got off the ground with a loan from the National Right to Work Committee. Larson has acknowledged his role in helping to organize the group, even to having recommended to its leadership some members of its board of directors. The Public Service Research Council conceives of itself as a research institution, conducting studies and polls affecting the issue of public sector unions and illegal strikes. The group also goes by the name of Americans Against Union Control of Government. A spokesman has told a Richmond Times-Dispatch reporter that the two names are interchangeable.
Whereas one sounds more academic, the other can be used to arouse people.
And arouse people it does. A 1979 fundraising letter signed by Senator Jesse Helms informs readers of the
very real possibility of a relative handful of union bosses seizing control of America's government.
In order to prevent this catastrophe, the group has formed the Public Service Action Political Committee to contribute money to candidates with funds raised by Richard Viguieri. So great has been its successes that 3 times in 3 years the organization has outgrown its offices. The size of its staff has increased from 2 to roughly 30 full and part-time employees. 2 new right populist lobbies that seek basic changes in America's political structure, though not actively involved in political campaigns, are Populist Forum and Initiative America, both based in Washington. Populist Forum, a shoestring operation that attempts to monitor, co-opt, and encourage right-wing populism, was involved in the textbook controversies in West Virginia and the anti-busing protests in South Boston. Initiative America, another low-budget operation, is more specialized in pursuing its populist goals. This group lobbies for the National Initiative Amendment, a constitutional amendment to allow voters to put issues directly onto the ballot. The New Right's Fourth Estate. The American right now has an active, vigorous battery of publications and publicists, ranging from the eminently conservative William F. Buckley and National Review, not strictly New Right at all, to the neo-populist monthly Conservative Digest. Human Events, a Washington-based news weekly, part conservative, part New Right, provides in-depth coverage of Capitol Hill and political campaigns. Washington Weekly, a tabloid distributed in the capital area, reprints syndicated right-wing columnists and staff-written editorials focusing on the lapses of the established Washington Post and Washington Star, all served up in a sensationalist and hard-hitting style. Richard A. Viguerie, the New Right fundraiser, publishes Conservative Digest, a slick magazine geared towards Wallaceites, and the New Right Report, a twice-monthly news selector for right-wing political activists. Outside of Washington, right-of-center publications like the Manchester in New Hampshire, Union Leader, the Richmond, Virginia News Leader, the Arizona Republic, and the Santa Ana, California, Register provide a movement perspective for local readers. Their editors sometimes contribute to the national rightist publications. These magazines and newspapers, taken together with such non-New Right establishment publications as the Wall Street Journal, the Saturday Evening Post, and U.S. News and World Report, ensure that conservative views are well represented in the national news media. Political commentators also proliferate on the right. 4 of the nation's most widely syndicated columnists, William F. Buckley, James J. Kilpatrick, and Pulitzer Prize winners George F. Will and William Safire, are unapologetic conservatives, but are not New Rightists. They are flanked to their right by a small army of New Right publicists, including former Nixon speechwriter Patrick J. Buchanan, John D. Lofton Jr., and longtime Indianapolis News editor M. Stanton Evans. Of growing stature as a columnist, pollster, and author is Kevin Phillips, another former Nixon aide, whose books, The Emerging Republican Majority and Mediocrity, Politics and Power in the Communications Age, have helped to shape right-wing political strategy throughout the 70s. Less known right-wing commentators include Lee Edwards, Alan Brownfield, and libertarian David Brudnoy, who distribute their own newspaper columns. The right-wingers also have their own publishing houses, where many books that could not have been published elsewhere are well received and publicized through advertisements in periodicals like Human Events and Conservative Digest. Arlington House, in New Rochelle, New York, once an enterprise of the Buckley family, is now independent of the Buckleys and distributes many of its books through the Conservative Book Club, although Arlington House has published such successful works as Kevin Phillips's The Emerging Republican Majority. It also publishes books of a less mainstream appeal like Hippies, Drugs, and Promiscuity, How to Survive in Your Liberal School, and None Dare Call It Witchcraft. Green Hill Publications of Ottawa, Illinois, run by American Conservative Union activist James Campaign, publishes paperbacks like The Gun Owner's Political Action Manual, How to Start Your Own School, and North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms's Where Free Men Shall Stand. Law and order interest groups. Working closely with the highly sophisticated Washington, D.C. based New Right organizations in constituting a major element of the New Right network are the many single-issue groups that have in recent years come to play such an important role in electoral politics. While often unprofessionally organized, ad hoc, and confined to local controversies, they nevertheless make up an important part of the New Right constituency. One that is organizationally sophisticated is the single-minded gun lobby, a growing power within New Right politics. The National Rifle Association, a well-financed and lavish operation in downtown Washington, was long assumed to be the leading pro-gun group, but that assumption is no longer valid. The association, which has systematically de-emphasized the gun control issue and put more stress on gun safety, environmentalism, and the like, came under attack in 1977 by hardcore gun enthusiasts and some of the crankier zealots on the far right as being too liberal. One result was a power struggle within the 1.2 million member organization, during which a faction that columnist John Chamberlain called the Ecological Revolutionists almost took control. The association, seeking to raise large sums of money for Western land development, had sought aid from a public relations firm, Orem Associates, which urged the group to change its image by playing down the anti-gun control activities of its Washington-based Initiative for Legislative Action. When the smoke had cleared, the pro-gun forces within the organization had successfully resisted the so-called ecological revolutionists, but two new and more militant pro-gun groups benefited from the infighting. The Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, for example, claims to have doubled its budget to $1.5 million in 1978 over the preceding years. Its 1979 membership was reported to be 176,000, small considering its considerable clout on Capitol Hill. Although directed from its headquarters in Bellevue, Washington, where it is part of a growing empire of quasi-political groups associated with New Right entrepreneur Alan M. Gottlieb, its public relations office in the Capitol is in the capable hands of a tough-talking lobbyist, John Snyder. Snyder edits its blistering newsletter, Point Blank. The second group to profit from the troubles within the NRA is Gun Owners of America, formed by California Republican State Senator H.L. Bill Richardson of Sacramento, a one-time field representative of the John Birch Society. Gun Owners, with Vigiri as its fundraiser, is now under the direction of Larry Pratt, a former executive director of the American Conservative Union. It claims more than 200,000 members. Through its affiliate, Gun Owners Political Action Committee, it supports anti-gun control candidates. Also concerned with law and order, the Americans for Effective Law Enforcement, formed in 1966 in Evanston, Illinois, works to counteract the influence of the liberal American Civil Liberties Union. Its founders, including former Chicago Police Chief O.W. Wilson, believe that as long as the ACLU represents the rights of the accused, someone should represent those of the victim and the law enforcement officer. Under the leadership of attorney Frank Carrington, author of two books, The Defenseless Society and The Victims, the organization dispenses legal aid through its victims' rights and legal defense centers, but it's most effective, Carrington believes, through its use of amicus curiae legal briefs. Said Carrington,
"The court has in effect conceded that we are an informed source. We can bring in more empirical or intellectual data. We also bring in other cases to show prejudice."
In one case in which the organization submitted an amicus curiae brief, it attempted to persuade the court that police officers may enter the residence of a narcotics suspect if the police are in hot pursuit. It was out of a similar concern for domestic order that the American Security Council, now the most influential group on the right, dedicated to a strong national defense, was formed in 1955. Now ensconced in an 850-acre estate in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, it grossed $1.8 million for the fiscal year ending in March 31st, 1977, and experienced, it reported, a threefold increase in membership over the preceding 4 years. Although it was founded to fight international subversion, hence its name, the group has made the transition from a Cold War outfit concerned with domestic communism to a modern lobby that promotes beefed-up defense budgets quite successfully, as its fundraising records suggest. It works to mobilize support for development of new missile systems, and in 1978, opposition to cancellation of the B-1 bomber. Of special significance, perhaps, is the American Security Council's contribution of $386,000 in 1977 for creation of a Center for International Security Studies, one form of which functions in connection with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., offering a graduate program in national security studies. Single-issue family lobbies. The rise of single-issue groups such as the gun committees and the anti-abortion activists, while superficially a blessing to the New Right organizers, has been something of a frustration to them as well. The leaders are enormously grateful that these groups exist, and they work with them whenever possible. But efforts to co-opt them into a larger New Right movement have not always been successful. This lack of success certainly characterized the New Right's links to Right to Life, a movement unto itself, and Phyllis Schlafly's 50,000-member Eagle Forum. These women's groups, while temperamentally related and overlapping other New Right causes, have maintained organizational independence. See Chapter 5. Schlafly is undoubtedly a right-winger, through and through. She serves on the American Conservative Union Board and speaks regularly to right-wing groups, but her Stop ERA Eagles are only loyal to her. She emphatically denies that they are in any significant way adjuncts of
the conservative movement.
Jealous of the lists of her dedicated supporters, she does not allow their names to be bought or rented, to the dismay of professional list brokers and fundraisers who would dearly love to fuse them into a larger bank of right-wing names. Eagle Forum is supported by $5 and up membership dues, but Schlafly can almost at will raise thousands of dollars more when the need arrives. Newsweek reported in 1979 that before the Equal Rights Amendment votes were taken in the Nevada, North Carolina, Florida, and Illinois legislatures, Schlafly issued an emergency call to her followers. One Missouri housewife responded with a check for $2,000, representing the proceeds from the sale of 450 coconut layer cakes she whipped up in 2 months of nonstop baking. The Right to Life movement is a successful, broad-based, and well-organized national coalition. New right leaders have been working to seize control of it and turn its political clout to their own uses, but without complete success. The Right to Lifers have their own press, their own political action committee, the National Pro-Life PAC, even their own political party, which in 1978 fielded candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination and the governorship of New York State. In the statewide race, the Right to Life Party drew more votes than New York's Liberal Party and threatened to render the Conservative Party obsolete. The chairman of the National Right to Life Committee is Dr. Mildred Jefferson, an articulate black surgeon from Boston. Its 1976 presidential candidate was Ellen McCormick, a Roman Catholic housewife and Democrat from Long Island. The Right to Lifers' great strength lies in the fact that they have not diluted their single-minded constituency by trying to make common cause with, say, the gun and free enterprise lobbies. As a result, they may well be one of the most powerful political forces in the country, ranking with the American Medical Association, the AFL-CIO, and the major political parties themselves. Candidates backed by the National Right to Life Committee, who won in 1978, included Republican Senators Roger Jepsen of Iowa, Jesse Helms of North Carolina, and Rudy Bolshevitz of Minnesota, and Republican Congressman Larry Pressler of South Dakota, who announced in 1979 his intention to seek the GOP nomination. With justification, the Right to Lifers are proud of the way their organization cuts across ideological lines, drawing huge support, for example, from New Deal Democrats of the industrial Northeast. They seem wary, therefore, of attempts to influence them by professional right-wingers or efforts to associate them with what appears to be a much narrower constituency. There is little evidence that the Right to Lifers share the same overriding concerns about their country as the more comprehensive New Right activists do. Mrs. McCormick, for example, favors gun registration, daycare centers for the poor, detente with the Soviets, and abolition of capital punishment, all of which strike the New Right as dangerously liberal. This is not to suggest the absence of cooperation between the primary New Right organizations and the autonomous single-issue groups. There is cooperation and a significant overlap in the membership of these organizations. Efforts are made to further this cooperation, for example. The decision in 1977 to place groups devoted to the preservation of the traditional societal roles of the family, the churches, and the schools, which are the generalized concerns of the anti-abortion, anti-busing, anti-equal rights amendment, and anti-gay rights constituencies, under the more inclusive rubric of pro-family movement. This larger area of concern includes two very active and notable elements of the New Right coalition. These groups have risen to address the problems of the public schools and the opponents of gay rights. This latter group, in addition, is an offshoot of what seems to be an intensifying interest in politics on the part of a number of fundamentalist Protestant evangelicals. When in 1977, Anita Bryant conducted a successful campaign to repeal by referendum a Dade County, Florida ordinance that would have prohibited the firing of homosexual teachers in private schools, her efforts were made possible to a great extent by the organizational skills of Mike Thompson, a Miami public relations expert who serves as chairman of the Florida Conservative Union and produced the two documentaries for the American Conservative Union that opposed the Panama Canal treaties and SALT II. Out of the Dade County struggles grew Save Our Children Incorporated, Protect America's Children. The political arm of the Bryant organization moved on to similarly successful efforts in Oregon, Minnesota, and Kansas. 17 full-time staff members were working for the Bryant organization when I spoke with Ed Rowe, a fundamentalist minister who is executive director of the Bryant organizations, in 1979. And it planned to branch out into production of television and radio commercials to publicize
God, family, and country
rallies. The pro-family forces also came together in the West Virginia textbook protests of September of '74. The Heritage Foundation sent attorney James McKenna to act as counsel to the protesting parents, and a representative of Populist Forum handled press relations for the protesters. From Texas, the husband and wife team of Mel and Norma Gabler, activists in Texas textbook struggles, lent their support. Mrs. Gabler traveled to West Virginia to help. In 1975, the Heritage Foundation formed the National Congress for Educational Excellence, intended to unite the widely scattered parents as groups, but the effort had only limited success. Jill Wilson, a Wisconsin housewife, active in Canossians concerned for their schools, and People of America responding to educational needs in today's society, aka parents, wrote in a letter to me,
To make a long, sad story short, Onali and I and most of the board members left this marvelous dream group after 2 years because unfortunately our choice of leadership was, as far as I can see, our only mistake, but the individual who was president became very possessive and power-hungry, and for some reason, I'm not sure why, she wanted all the board members of this national group to be from her surrounding community in Texas. The activities that took place were incredible, and although I feel we had a court case, I and others decided that rather than waste our time and money fighting in a court case, we would just withdraw from the group and go home and keep up the good work as we had done in the past. Hence, I was again in the same position, except now I had met personally with people like Onali, George Archibald, the Marchner girls, and others who were active nationally, and also people from Wisconsin who also cared enough to do something besides tell me to keep up the good work.
The anti-busing groups, another element of the pro-family forces, are more sophisticated than parents. Protesters from South Boston, for example, have been aided by the Phillips-Figueroa Conservative Caucus and, at Howard Phillips's suggestion, formed a monthly luncheon group, attended not only by anti-busing activists, but also by Dr. Mildred Jefferson, national chairman of the National Right to Life Committee. In Los Angeles, Bus Stop launched a full-fledged direct mail fundraising campaign organized by Arnold Steinberg, once press secretary to U.S. Senator James L. Buckley of New York. He runs a political affairs consulting firm in Sherman Oaks, California. By far the slickest of these pro-family operations, however, are the television evangelists of the South and Southwest, who are focusing on increasing attention on conservative politics. Chief among these is the Reverend Jerry Falwell, the fundamentalist preacher from Lynchburg, Virginia. Through his new political organization, Moral Majority Incorporated, Falwell, with the help of new right leader Howard Phillips, is organizing other right-wing television evangelists and religious leaders into what they hope will be a united front for
God and country.
interlocking directorates. Coordinating the activities of the far-flung ad hoc home and family groups was the task of Conservative Caucus, under the leadership of Howard Phillips and Richard A. Viguerie since 1975.
The answer is not another Washington-centered institution that claims to speak for people all over the country,
Phillips explained.
The answer is to build a local structure through which people can speak for themselves.
This is not, however, how the organization actually functioned. An early caucus organizer told me that
Howie was very heavy-handed in his approach to the people he attracted to the idea, and the people who had the skills and experience to really put together a political organization resented it. He had a set of rules they had to follow, and they couldn't deviate from them in the least.
As Phillips learned, it was impossible to bring all the single-issue groups together under one roof. The organizer explained to me,
What he didn't realize is that you just cannot expect the gun owners, for example, to have the same commitment in terms of energy and time and money to the Conservative Caucus that they have to something really tangible, like a gun club or a labor union. It is just not realistic.
The project was also enormously costly, and the heavy mailings that Viguerie made to keep the organization afloat prompted one Washington rag to begin calling the project
Conservatives for Cash.
When it was said to be near death because of financial difficulties in 1978, it became known as
Conservative Carcass.
It was always in debt, a close aide of Phillips told me. All the distinct organizations were ordered to
send their funds, which they were expected to raise on their own, to the national headquarters. There, any expenditures had to be approved by Howie. If the money was spent, they had to send receipts. Sometimes they were reimbursed and sometimes they weren't. Things got so bad that more and more of the activities of the national office were being paid for, whether members liked it or not, out of resources raised by the local organizations. If Howie wanted to hold a statewide conference, he would just announce that he was going to do it. Then the local organizations would say they didn't want one yet, that they were not organizationally prepared. He'd say he didn't care, that they were going to have a conference anyway, and he would fly out at their expense and pay the speaker out of their funds too.
The leaders of the New Right meet continually at luncheons, dinners, over drinks at Capitol Hill receptions, at formal meetings, and at weekly Kingston High Command sessions, named for a banquet room in a Washington hotel where the first such meetings were held. There they discussed tactics and the strategy of the movement as a whole with the individual participants who, in never-ending permutations from the governing and advisory boards, officers, and staff of rightist lobbies, political action committees, legal defense funds, and research and education institutes. The same names appear over and over on dozens of letterheads on the stationery of groups like the National Right to Work Committee, the American Conservative Union, the Conservative Caucus, the Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, Young Americans for Freedom, and the American Security Council, the Heritage Foundation, and others. The most frequent names are Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, Congressman Robert Dornan of California, Howard Phillips, Paul Weyrich, Morton Blackwell, Phyllis Schlafly, Barbara Keating, John T. Dolan, Roger Stone, and M. Stanton Evans. These leaders and others are building a political movement that has already reshaped in significant ways the face of Congress, stalled legislation in its tracks, and pushed through initiatives and referenda. It has its eye on the presidency in coming years, vowing, as one New Right leader told me,
to take control of the culture.
Unlike right-wing zealots of the recent past, the New Right has built the organizational structure to make good that